Good afternoon. My name is Keith Ward. I'm the communications specialist at the Hariri Institute for Computing. I'm here today to announce the speakers for the Faculty Lightning Talks. Last November, we released an invitation to speak to the faculty to talk more about their data science work. We had an enormous response, and so we're certainly excited, and they're excited to share their work with us regarding data science. The format for today will be 2 minutes in length, and the presenters will be presenting one slide. Please pay close attention to our timekeeper. At 30 seconds, she'll let you know when you have 30 seconds left, and then once again, she'll let you know at the 2-minute mark. After 2 minutes, just remember you're surrounded by a lot of people who are very hungry for lunch. So with that, let's get started. The first speaker is Naomi Casselli, Assistant Professor of Deaf Studies, followed by Gerald Denis.
Hi. So what I'd like to do is just start by asking you to imagine a deaf child. How do they communicate? How do they talk? I've got the slide. Hey, I'll give you the slide in a second. Yeah. So I just don't want you to get distracted by the slide. So how do they communicate, right? Are they wearing a cochlear implant? Do they use hearing aids? Are they using sign language? So it turns out that even with some really great advances in hearing technology and things like that, most deaf children still have trouble learning how to use a spoken language like English. 95% of them have hearing parents who don't know sign language. That means that they have restricted access to both spoken and sign language during the first years of life, which is a really devastating problem and has cascading effects on many aspects of development. So what we want to do is solve that problem by connecting kids to sign language. And to do that, we need some tools, a lot of tools, in fact. But we're focusing on the ASL lexicon, the vocabulary of ASL in my lab. And so we have, there we go. We have developed a lexical database called ASL Lex, which is a repository of information about sign language, about the vocabulary of sign language. So we have information about how frequently signs are used, whether they're nouns or verbs. We have videos for each sign, a lot of information about each sign. We've organized that lexicon kind of like we think people's mental lexicons, their mental dictionaries are organized. So here you can see each node in that visualization represents a single sign, and they're organized into neighborhoods of signs that are what we call phonologically related. So you can see the signs shiny and sharp and planet all kind of look the same. They have the same hand shape. They're produced in the same location. They're rhyming signs. So that's what those clusters are, is neighborhoods of rhyming signs in ASL. And so we have developed that data set manually, coding every hand shape, every location, every movement by hand, and we'd like to not do that anymore. So we've been investigating the possibility of using deep learning and NLP to try and come up with a classifier for those, for that ASL phonology to identify what those locations and hand shapes and things like that are. And we think that could be useful so that a family who's learning sign language with their deaf child could look up a sign in our dictionary using sign language without having to know a translation of a sign or figure out how to look up a sign in some other way. Ultimately, we also think that could be useful for things like an ASL Siri, something like that, but it's small steps. We're also in my lab thinking about developing ASL vocabulary tests to try and understand what kids acquire and when, which signs do they know at which ages, which signs are more learnable than others, that kind of thing. So we're developing an assessment to try and learn about how children acquire vocabulary in American Sign Language. We also think that that could be used as a universal screener for language deprivation to identify whether children are falling behind in their language acquisition trajectories. So my lab has expertise. We have a lot of deaf people working in my lab, a lot of native ASL users. We bring a lot of expertise in the about the community, about the population of deaf children, and about ASL linguistics. And I would love to work with people who have more expertise thinking about pose estimation, that kind of thing, using computer vision, who have that kind of background. So.
Thank you, Naomi. Next, we have Gerald Denis, Associate Professor of Pharmacology and Medicine, followed by Michael Dietz.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to talk about a medical problem that leads to a data problem that then returns back to a medical problem. So if you look at this 2x2, this is a great way of thinking about the problem of obesity and cancer and metabolic disease in clinical populations. So people in the upper left-hand category we're most familiar, people who are lean or non-obese and metabolically healthy, so most of the people in this room. And then in the lower right-hand corner, people who are metabolically unhealthy and obese. This is typically what we think of when people develop obesity, hypertension, diabetes, lots of metabolic complications, cardiovascular disease, and stroke. But there's two interesting off-diagonal populations, people here on the lower left-hand side who are obese but relatively healthy. This is about a quarter of the American obese population, and these individuals typically are low risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and they're often low inflammation. And it's around a quarter or so of the people we see at Boston Medical Center, and their cancer rates are actually lower. And in the other corner are the people who are relatively unhealthy but lean. So these are people who are diabetic and typically live in India or China or Southeast Asia. So here's the problem. If a breast cancer of the very same stage and subtype is diagnosed in each of these four groups, is this the same kind of cancer? Is this one disease or is it four? So at the moment, this question is not being addressed in the medical world. And the kinds of information that we would need to answer this question are not being collected medically. So here's a question now for data scientists. How should we be gathering the kinds of information that we need? So are the data fields available? And if so, how do we pay for that? Because each of the tests required, like blood glucose or a measure of blood pressure or something else, costs money. So now it's a conversation back to medicine. Now data science has identified a problem. How should clinicians charge for it? Should these things be covered by insurance? Is this a research study? Once it becomes the standard of care, will insurance cover this kind of data? So our models actually are limited by what's actually been collected. So as we design mathematical models or predictors to understand risks in these populations, our model should be flexible enough to incorporate new data fields. So it clearly has to be a conversation between basic science or clinical science and data science moving forward. So that's both the challenge and the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Next, we have Michael Dietz, Associate Professor at Ecological Forecasting Lab, followed by Daniel Fulford.
Ooh, that didn't render quite as I thought it would. I'm Mike Dietz, and I am founding director of the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, which is a grassroots academic consortium across a wide range of researchers across academia and agencies, thinking about how we can kind of solve the challenge of predicting nature, both as a research question and as one that informs environmental decision making. Give some examples of what sorts of problems we deal with in my own lab. We work on forecasting ticks, tick-borne disease risk in their small mammal hosts, algal blooms, carbon cycle, water cycle, vegetation phenology, so leaf on and leaf off, the soil microbiome, but the broader consortium works on a wide range of different environmental problems. And really what we're embracing is this idea of thinking about what we call near-term iterative forecasts, so forecasts that are occurring over time scales from any scale from sub-daily to interannual but really ones that are responding to data that is coming in continuously and being updated as new data becomes available. And so there's a lot of interesting questions that this consortium is trying to tackle that are sort of cross-cutting across a bunch of different problems, and some of those really have to do with the cyber infrastructure to support iterative forecasting and the methods that we use to do forecasts. I think both of those are really areas that really would hit home when it comes to the data science community, as well as also more broadly thinking about how we advance theory and education and decision support in these areas, and to build this, oops, that was my timer saying I'm out of time. Building a community of practice and working with industry and stakeholders and citizen science. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Next, we have Daniel Fulford, the Assistant Professor of Occupational Therapy, followed by Suzanne Mitchell.
Thanks. As many as half of the people, my background slide didn't come up. So I have a picture of a lonely person, because what I'm talking about today is loneliness and social isolation. So loneliness and social isolation are pretty prevalent, so up to 50% of people in this room would report that they feel isolated or lonely at least some of the time, and in many cases a lot of the time. So this led to a lot of popular media press that showed that these loneliness problems are actually impactful because there's a 25 to 30% increased chance of early mortality among people who report this loneliness or social isolation. So even the former Surgeon General said that loneliness is killing us. So what we don't know so much about is how loneliness happens, how it plays out in day-to-day life, and how that loneliness results in these health problems over time. My research focuses on using smartphone technology to identify kind of moment-to-moment characterization of human behavior in situ when they're actually in their day-to-day lives. We use things like GPS, accelerometer, Bluetooth, microphone to characterize people's behaviors over weeks of time, months of time. And what's exciting about this is that there's a lot of data. What's very frustrating about this is that there's a lot of data. So we're trying to figure out how to use those data to come up with answers around how do we predict not only social isolation and loneliness, but other problems that are relevant for clinical populations. And I'm a psychologist, so I deal with a lot of mental health issues. So what we could do with these data, what I'm excited about the possibility of, is using things like machine learning algorithms to conduct conversation detection using the microphone of a cell phone. So to know whether people are engaging in conversation and with whom. I'm also interested in using kind of data imputation approaches with our geolocation or GPS data to understand where people are spending their time. Are they alone, at home? Are they with others? When can we know and where can we know people are so that we can identify when they're in need of a potential intervention? And then ultimately, we want to take this information and do things like use statistical network analyses to characterize moment-by-moment fluctuations or changes or shifts in the states of social isolation and loneliness. If we can do that, then we can use the phone itself not as just an assessment tool, but an intervention tool to help people who are struggling with this isolation and loneliness. So I need your help to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Next, we have Suzanne Mitchell, Associate Professor of Family Medicine, followed by Chmic Melson.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm here to talk about diabetes and social risk factors. More than 27 million Americans are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And we know that people with type 2 diabetes who have unmet social needs have a higher risk for poor health outcomes, including high rates for hospitalizations, more than 7 million hospitalizations a year, as well as unplanned rehospitalizations that result from having unmet social needs, such as needs for housing, food, including things like loneliness and things like feeling like a burden to their families. I work on Project RED, the re-engineered discharge, and our work there, looking at risk for readmissions, identified 21 social domains that can contribute to a person's increased risk for an unplanned hospitalizations. the available methods that we have to look at unmet social needs are cumbersome at the very least, and we haven't figured out a way to comprehensively assess the unmet social needs that patients face. So we decided to see if we could figure out a tool using data science and digital technology to come up with a better solution. So we were just funded, so we're pretty excited about that, to go ahead and develop a tool that we're calling the Re-Engineered Discharge for Diabetes Using Computer Adaptive Test, or REDCAT, which I think is a cool name. REDCAT will be a smart test that will be designed to ascertain an individual's sort of fingerprint for social risk that will be able to help people on the front lines at the points of care when social need intersects with healthcare needs. And so we think that this has the potential to really individualize addressing social needs for patients at the point of care where those social needs are starting to come to play. So if you're interested in the intersection in social determinants of health and healthcare, we would love to talk to you about helping out with our project. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Next, we have Chmic Melson, Research Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering, followed by Christophe Nolte.
Hello. I'm doing research on complex systems and information theory. And one of the key insights I've developed is that information theory is a lot easier to understand if you translate the results back to a probability where you started. An example of this is the Gaussian distribution. We all know what the mean and standard deviation is, but oftentimes entropy as a concept is misunderstood and not well known and used. On the other hand, if you take entropy and you translate it back to a probability, for the Gaussian distribution, it turns out to be just the density at the mean plus the standard deviation. And it is visually then just the central tendency of the y-axis. An area where we've been applying this is in evaluating forecasts. So a nice example of this was the 2016 election, where there was an upset, and there was a lot of criticism of the polls being wrong. But what's not well understood is that some of the pollsters, like 358 and the New York Times, were actually very accurate in predicting the uncertainty of this election. And that's shown on this graph where we have the forecasted probabilities per state, and then on the y-axis is actually what happened, the measured histograms. And there's a histogram of this, and then the fact that the metrics are near that dashed line is an indication that although it was a hard election to predict, some of the pollsters were accurate that it was hard. We've particularly been interested in applying this to complex systems and have a metric that we call a risk profile. And you can see an example of this in the poster session. Gigi Ling and Suchin Chow are going to show an example of a machine learning algorithm that generates images, and they're able to do a very simple probabilistic forecast of those images. So come talk some more.
Thank you, Chmic. Next, we have Christophe Nolte, Assistant Professor of Geography and Environment, followed by Gustavo Sprinkler.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This talk will be interesting for those who have ever thought about either buying land or protecting land. I'm looking for people that love machine learning and would like to join me in answering this question. How much is this property? How much is it worth? This is a 1,000-acre property in Colorado. Has a lake, has a river flowing through it. Pretty nice place. And how much is it worth if you can't ever develop it? Why would you think about this question? Well, because this property is home to a lot of other species whom we would like to give a home. The good news is this property now is protected. It can never be developed. There's an easement on it, an instrument of which there are about 150,000 instances or more in the United States. And this question has been answered by someone who's a professional appraiser. He said, it's worth 9 million if it's not restricted, and 3.6 if it's restricted. The state of Colorado paid the difference to protect the space forever, and the landowner turned around and sold it for 6.5. So the quantification of the value of easement is a massive problem in the land conservation community. It has been exploited as a tax loophole in the amount of about $1 billion yearly. And I have the goal to predict what an easement is worth. With data from about 1 million sales, land sales in the United States, for which I've been building a large-scale parcel database, which has a lot of information about each individual parcels, including Zillow. This is data for much of the data comes from Zillow, who specializes in predicting housing prices, but not land prices. So I'm very curious about what methods we can work with. I've actually run a random forest and have been better at predicting the sale price of this property than the appraiser was. So I see there's a huge potential. And if you're interested in working with me, either in joining me in the grant that I'm currently writing, or in just playing with the data and see who competes best in the prediction game, I'll be in the table in the back. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christophe. Next, we have Gustavo Sprinkler, Assistant Professor of Finance, followed by Gianluca Stringini.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to be kind of showing an example of something that I think is pretty useful for economists that we are not really taking advantage of. And so here's how it goes, right? So we have, the US economy is comprised of like many, many different firms. We have about 4,000 or 5,000 publicly traded firms. We have a whole bunch of banks, and all of these different entities in the network of firms in the US, of course, interact with each other in different ways. We have customer-supplier relationships, we have banking, we have trading, we have trade credit. There's all of these interactions between the different entities in the network. And one thing we know very well already is, from a theoretical point of view, is that how these links are built between different corporations and the kind of network structure that we obtain from it really matters for aggregate risk. So if we think about kind of GDP growth, recessionary periods, if we think about inflation, unemployment, one thing that really matters is basically how are these firms connected? How are those risks spread from one firm to the next? Now, this we know from a theoretical point of view. As a statistician, or as an econometrician, as we call ourselves in economics, one of the issues that we face is that we just really don't have data, right? We don't know what these links are. There's very few data sets that provide any sort of overview of how firms are connected. We have some data on interbank connections, so the connections between banks, how they borrow and lend to each other. But these data tend to be proprietary for central banks. We have some data on customer-supplier relationships, but firms don't really have to report these data. Very frequently, they have to report it once a year, and they don't even have to report all of the relationships they have. So we have very sparse data on this just subset of links, which is customer-supplier networks, right? But there's all sort of different links, and really, the problem here is that we just don't know what these links are. We don't know how to even measure these links. Now, one thing that I've been working on with a PhD student of mine is really looking at the news, right? We know that the news reports a lot about the different connections between firms, right? The news often reports about shocks that affect the customer and how it affects the supplier. It reports about bank relationships, IPOs. It reports about all of these different events that provide information about what these links should be. And one of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to use the news to kind of identify relationship between firms that are reported in the news. And based on these information, then build a network of firms that kind of resembles what we should be able to see in the data if we had access to this data. So we started exploring this. So the idea here is really using text data to try to assess relationships between different business and financial entities. And we've shown that this is possible. We've written a paper using a subset of data that we have, and we show that this can be done, and it's really informative about what is there. Now, of course, this kind of tools can be used for many different things. We've already exploring using this for analyzing cryptocurrencies. We've explored it to analyzing relationships between countries. So there's a lot of information in the news and generally in text data that can be used for the purpose of predicting financial and economic risks. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. That's all I had. So thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Next, we have Lucca Stringini, an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering.
All right. Hello, everybody. So if you think about the internet is quite a complex environment composed of many different online services where people go to do whatever the service is supposed to do. And these services do not exist in isolation. So if we think about how information flows around the internet, we will have people seeing, for example, a news article on Reddit and then going on Twitter and discussing it and so on and so forth. So to understand how information flows, we need to look at the entirety of this ecosystem. And we also need to look not only at text, but also at images, image representations and videos and so on and so forth. Now, virtually all research that has been done on understanding how information flows online has focused on a single service at a time. And as you can imagine, if we do that, we miss a lot of context. If we think about what I'm interested in, which is what I call weaponized information, so hate speech, conspiracy theories, disinformation, and so on and so forth, if you think of conspiracy theories, they typically are created on polarized communities, like whatever, 4chan or certain parts of Reddit and whatnot, and then they become mainstream. And they get talked about on Twitter and so forth. They get talked about on news sites. People go on these news sites, they discuss in the comments, and the discussion keeps going. So what I'm doing in my research is developing methods and models to actually understand how information flows across these multiple online services. But as you can imagine, this is not a purely technical problem. So we have social aspects there, we have psychological aspects, and so on and so forth. So what I'm interested in here is actually figuring out if someone would like to work on these kind of topics and help us develop these kind of techniques. And some of the questions that we could answer, for example, is can we actually predict online hate attacks? So if we see some certain type of discussion about a person on a polarized community, can we predict that this person will get attacked on Twitter or something like that? Can we actually learn what organic news distribution looks like and understand, identify coordinated campaigns, this sort of state-sponsored disinformation campaigns that everybody's talking about, and so on and so forth. Can we find where racist or hateful content comes from? And can we actually identify hotspots where, this hateful content is generated? So can we actually identify it early before it spreads to the mainstream internet, if you like? And yeah, that's it. Thanks. And now I think there is lunch, right? No? There is someone else? Okay.
Thank you, Gianluca. Let's thank all of our lightning talk speakers. Next is lunch, located in the lobby, and we welcome you to come back in and sit at one of the round tables where there'll be a panelist speaker to continue the conversation. Also, don't forget to stop by the Spark booth way at the back with Zeba Cranmer. They have a lot of interesting things to share as well. Thank you.